I spent my entire life building a fortress, stone by stone, year after year. I made sure no one could ever get in. It worked perfectly. People looked at the walls and they walked away. They called me strong, independent, and completely untouchable, but they did not understand the truth. The strength was just a costume for the fear. I was terrified of what would happen if someone entered. Every woman before you saw the armor and retreated. They wanted the easy path, the open door. They did not want to bleed on the edges of my guard. So I stayed safe in the quiet isolation. I convinced myself I did not need a single soul. I told myself the second chapter of life was meant to be lived alone. Then, you arrived. You did not knock on the door or ask for permission. You did not demand that I lower the drawbridge. You simply looked at the fortress, and you saw the terrified man hiding inside. Let me tell you about the anatomy of a wall. It is not built in a single day. It is constructed over decades of disappointment and quiet betrayal. When a man learns that his vulnerability is a weapon, he stops handing that weapon to other people. He learns to swallow his needs and silence his heart. That is what they call a distant fortress, a place where nothing can grow, but nothing can be destroyed. I perfected this art of disappearing while standing right in front of you. I could sit across from a woman at dinner and be 1,000 miles away. My mind was always anticipating the eventual exit. I would watch for the slightest change in her voice. I would read her silence as a warning sign. I pushed them away before they ever had the chance to leave me. People called it intimidating. They said I was too cold, too detached, too difficult to read, and I let them believe every single word of it. Because if they thought I was dangerous, they would stay away. If they thought I was complicated, they would not try to fix me. You know exactly what I am talking about, do you not? You have lived through your own decades of people-pleasing. You have exhausted yourself trying to translate the silence of men like me. Your mind never stops moving. Your thoughts race in the quiet hours of the night. You overthink every word, every glance, every unreturned message. But your overthinking is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism you developed long ago. You were trained to anticipate danger and the empty spaces between two people, because, for so long, you loved too hard. You clung to the edges of relationships because you were never held tightly enough. You poured your softest energy into men who were terrified of it. You gave them your warmth, and they gave you their shadows. You tried to heal their hidden parts with your light, and it drained you until there was nothing left but exhaustion. You told yourself you were done trying to decode broken men. You reached a point where peace became more valuable than passion. You decided that your second chapter would be quiet and protected. And then, our paths crossed. We were two heavily guarded souls standing across a crowded room, both of us carrying the heavy armor of our pasts. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have recognized the warning signs and retreated. But you did not flinch when you saw my darkness. You recognized the shape of my walls because you had built your own. You did not try to scale them or tear them down. You just stood there, watching me with those impossible eyes. You saw the machinery behind my silence. You understood that my distance was not an insult to you. It was a monument to the things I had survived. When I tried to pull my usual disappearing act, it failed. I offered you my coldness, expecting you to run. Instead, you just smiled a quiet, knowing smile. You did not chase me, and you did not shrink away. You simply held your ground with a terrifying stillness. Your stillness was the one thing I had no defense against. It dismantled the guard that had intimidated everyone else. Not with force, but with profound and quiet understanding. You decoded the locks that had kept my heart in a cage. I remember the exact moment I realized I was in danger. We were sitting together in absolute silence. The kind of silence that usually sent me searching for the nearest exit. But your presence did not demand anything from me. It did not ask me to perform or to prove my worth. It just allowed me to breathe in a space I had never felt before. I felt the stones of my fortress begin to crack. The fear of intimacy that had defined my life started to dissolve, not because I was suddenly brave, but because you were completely safe. And that safety was the most terrifying thing I had ever encountered. Let me explain why safety feels so dangerous to a man like me. When you spend your life anticipating the storm, the quiet warmth of the sun feels like a trap. I kept waiting for the catch. I kept waiting for you to reveal the hidden cost of your affection. Because in my world, love was always a transaction with a heavy tax. But days turned into weeks, and the catch never came. You remained constant, unwavering, and deeply anchored in your own truth. You possessed a quiet strength that did not need to shout to be heard. You did not try to manipulate the power dynamics between us. You had no interest in the petty games that younger hearts play. You were a woman who had crossed the desert and knew the value of water. I watched you navigate the world with a graceful resilience. You carried the scars of your past, but you did not let them poison the present. You had faced your own inner darkness and made peace with the shadows. That is why you were not afraid of mine. You recognized that my intimidating exterior was just a frightened child in a suit of armor. And you spoke to that child with a language he had never heard. You used the language of absolute presence. When you listened to me, you heard the words I could not bring myself to say. When you looked at me, you saw the man I was desperately trying to hide. You dismantled my defenses simply by refusing to fight them. Every time I put up a wall, you painted a window on it. Every time I retreated into the dark, you left a candle burning by the door. You gave me the space to be terrified, without ever making me feel abandoned. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you know how many lifetimes a man can search for that kind of grace? Chansip demand that you heal before they will love you. But you loved me right there in the middle of my ruin. You saw the broken pieces, and you decided they were worth your time. You chose to stay when every survival instinct told you to leave. And by staying, you ruined every other connection for me. You ruined the shallow conversations and the easy, empty relationships. You set a standard of intimacy that no one else could ever hope to reach. You showed me what it means to be truly seen. Not just observed, but deeply and completely comprehended. You translated my soul without ever opening a dictionary. This is the secret of a mature connection. It is not about finding someone who is perfectly whole. It is about finding the one person whose broken pieces fit with yours. The people who walked away from me, they were looking for a finished product. They wanted a man who had already solved all his psychological puzzles. They did not want to do the heavy lifting of true partnership. But you were different. You brought a lantern down into the basement of my mind. You helped me unpack the boxes I had kept sealed for 60 years. We sat together in the dust of my old regrets. You did not judge the coping mechanisms that had kept me alive. You honored the armor that had carried me through the wars of my youth. And then you gently asked me to take it off. You told me the war was over. You told me I did not have to fight the ghosts of my past anymore. You offered me a sanctuary where the exhausted soldier could finally rest. I fought you at first, of course. I tried to push you away with sharp words and sudden withdrawals. I tested your resolve with every trick I had learned in a lifetime of running. But you were immovable. You anchored yourself in the storm of my panic and simply held my hand. You proved that the bond between us was stronger than my fear of it. That is how you conquered the fortress. Not with a siege, but with an unconditional surrender to the truth. You saw the frightened man, and you loved him into bravery. You did what no one else had the courage or the patience to do. But taking off that armor was not a sudden relief. It was a complete agony. I realized how sharp the world actually feels without a heavy shield. The shock of being completely exposed to your eyes absolutely paralyzed me. I had spent my entire adult life perfecting the art of emotional absence. Suddenly, I was standing there with nowhere left to hide. Every single defense mechanism I relied on had been quietly neutralized. You did not use force to take my weapons away from me. You just made me realize how heavy they were to carry every single day. And when I dropped them, the echoes of my past finally caught up. I was forced to look back at the trail of wreckage I left behind. I saw the faces of the women who tried to deeply love a ghost. I felt a sickening anger at my own highly sophisticated cowardice. I remember the days when my phone would ring and I would just stare. I would watch the name of a good woman flash across the glowing screen, and I would let it ring until it stopped, feeling nothing but empty relief. I told myself I was protecting my highly valued peace and quiet. I convinced my own mind that relationships were just an endless series of demands. But the reality was that I lacked the basic courage to truly show up. I was a coward hiding behind a very expensive suit of manufactured stoicism. When a woman asked me for a deeper commitment, I gave her philosophical excuses. I spoke in riddles to keep her guessing about my true intentions and feelings. I weaponized my own complexity to keep everyone at a very safe distance. If they could never figure me out, they could never truly reject me. It was a brilliantly toxic strategy that kept my fragile ego perfectly intact, but it left my soul starving in the dark for half a century. Looking at your face, all of those old victories felt like massive defeats. I felt a crushing wave of sorrow for the time I stole from myself. I was so incredibly angry at the young man who built those thick walls. He thought he was being incredibly smart and utterly invincible against the world. He did not realize he was just building a very quiet, lonely tomb. But mostly, I was terrified at how close I came to ruining our connection. I almost handed you the exact same cold silence that destroyed all the others. I almost let my deep fear of intimacy cost me my absolute final chance. You triggered every instinct I had to run for the distant hills. My mind screamed at me to shut down and lock the iron gates immediately. It told me that letting a woman like you inside was a fatal mistake. But you did something that short-circuited my entire nervous system. You did not ask me to apologize for the fortress I had built. You did not demand a sudden, miraculous transformation into a totally vulnerable man. You just sat with me in the middle of all that silent ruin. And in that stillness, a brutal illumination washed over my tired mind. I finally understood the lies I had been telling myself for 50 long years. I had to unlearn every single rule I had written about personal survival. The old rules said that vulnerability was a fatal weakness to be swiftly eliminated. The new reality showed me that vulnerability was the only bridge to actual life. Strength does not mean never letting anyone see your hands physically shake. Strength means letting them shake while you reach out to touch someone anyway. True power is not found in remaining perfectly unaffected by the chaotic world. True power is having the courage to let someone truly matter to you. Protection does not mean building a massive wall that keeps absolutely everyone out. Protection means trusting yourself enough to survive being completely and deeply known. Peace does not mean a quiet, empty house where nothing ever goes wrong. Peace means knowing you have someone who will stay when the brutal storm hits. You taught me that chronic isolation is just a very slow, painless death. Real survival is learning to breathe the same air as another human being. It is looking at a woman who could ruin you, and staying anyway. It is giving up the illusion of absolute control for the reality of connection. I had to mourn the total loss of my untouchable, intimidating persona. It was the only reliable identity I had known since I was a youth. But looking into your profound eyes, I knew the terrifying trade was worth it. For months, I believed a very specific story about what happened between us. I told myself you were simply outsmarting my complex psychological defenses. I thought you possessed some rare magic ability to bypass my relentless logic. I framed it as if I was the helpless victim of your profound empathy. I told myself you were just the one woman who absolutely refused to quit. It was a comfortable story because it removed all the heavy responsibility from me. If you broke in, then I did not have to admit that I wanted you. If you dismantled the guard, I could pretend I was still the tough man. But late one night, while you were sleeping next to me, the truth hit. The truth is much darker and far more intentional than I ever admitted aloud. It is a confession I have kept buried under layers of stubborn male pride, and it changes everything you thought you knew about those difficult early days. You did not break the heavy locks on the massive doors of my mind. You did not secretly decipher a complex code that everyone else had totally failed. You were not a quiet thief who slipped past the watchtower in the night. I saw you standing there in the cold, and I made a deliberate choice. I walked down to the heavy iron gates myself with a racing heart, and with trembling hands, I unlocked them and pulled them wide open for you. I handed you the exact weapon that could finally and completely destroy me. I made a conscious, terrifying choice to let you dismantle the intimidating guard. You did not force your way into the absolute darkest rooms of my psyche. I laid down the heavy armor and I invited you inside the fortress. I knew exactly what I was doing when I let my perfect silence slip. I deliberately dropped the intimidating mask so you could see the fear hiding underneath. Why did I do it after all those decades of running away? Why would a man who spent his life avoiding capture suddenly and completely surrender? Why would I risk the perfectly controlled existence I had fiercely protected for forever? Because the deafening silence of my fortress had finally become louder than my fear. Because for the first time in 60 long years, I truly met my match. I looked at you and realized my constant avoidance was no longer a shield. It had become a dark prison, keeping me away from the only thing I wanted. I was not terrified of what you would do if you stayed in my life. I was completely paralyzed by the thought of what I would become if you left. I realized that losing you would hurt far more than letting you truly know me. That was the terrifying calculus that finally broke the stubborn, avoidant man. The pain of remaining hidden totally eclipsed the deep terror of being fully exposed. I remember the exact afternoon I made the final decision to let you in. You were sitting across the room, reading a book in the fading afternoon light. You looked so incredibly peaceful, so completely untethered to my internal chaos. I watched the way you turned the pages with a quiet, steady rhythm, and a terrifying thought struck me like a violent physical blow to the chest. I realized that you did not actually need me to survive your own life. You were whole and complete long before you ever learned my complicated name. If I pushed you away, you would simply gather your things and gracefully depart. You would mourn the loss, but you would never beg a man to love you. That realization totally shattered the last remaining pillar of my massive, fragile ego. I could not use my calculated distance to control you or keep you off balance. Your quiet feminine energy was completely immune to my sophisticated dark psychology tricks. So I staged a quiet rebellion against my own twisted, ruined survival instincts. When my brain screamed at me to pull away from you, I leaned closer. When my chest tightened with a desperate urge to run, I forced my feet to stay. Every single time I let you see a major flaw, it felt like bleeding. Every time I answered your probing questions honestly, I felt completely out of control. But I kept doing it because I knew it was the only way to keep you. I let you dismantle the guard because I desperately wanted to be dismantled by you. I wanted you to see the permanent damage and decide I was still entirely worthy. I needed you to look at the ugly mess and choose to sit in it. All those times you thought you were patiently chipping away at solid stone. I was on the inside, quietly dismantling the massive wall piece by piece to meet you. You were the only woman who ever made the exhausting work feel worth the risk. You did not just slip past my ancient defenses by a lucky accident. You were the only person I ever consciously deemed worthy of the total surrender. You see, the greatest illusion of the distant fortress is control. We convince ourselves we are the absolute masters of our isolation. But isolation is just a very quiet, slow-moving form of starvation. I spent my youth starving my heart to feed my massive ego. I wore my avoidant attachment style like a badge of dark honor. But you cannot wear a badge when your hands are physically shaking. And my hands shook the moment I realized you were actually staying. I realized that keeping you completely outside would be my final mistake. I would spend my second chapter turning into a bitter, lonely ghost. So I made the terrifying choice to let you truly see me. I did not do it because I was suddenly a very brave man. I did it because the thought of losing you was completely unbearable. You need to understand the profound weight of this very specific truth. Every man in your past who walked away was entirely a coward. They saw the depth of your soul, and they chose the shallow end. They abandoned you because your complexity demanded their absolute, painful evolution. They were too comfortable in their carefully constructed, emotionally stunted little lives. Do not ever blame your beautiful, overthinking mind for their sudden exits. You did not ask for too much from those incredibly weak, frightened men. You simply asked them to meet you in the deeper, darker, psychological waters, and they chose to safely drown in their own shallow puddles instead. But I looked at those exact same deep waters, and I bravely jumped. I let the heavy armor sink straight to the bottom of the ocean, because I knew you would be there to catch my breathless, sinking soul. That is the true hidden psychology behind an older man's sudden, total surrender. We do not change because we read a book or heard a lecture. We change because a woman looks at us and sees the frightened boy. You look past the Machiavellian tactics and the cold, calculated, manipulative silence. You saw the exhausted soldier who just wanted to finally come back home, and you became the only home my restless spirit has ever truly recognized. When I let you dismantle the guard, I gave you my absolute power. I handed you the loaded gun, and I simply closed my tired eyes. I trusted that your soft, feminine energy would never actually pull the trigger. And you did not pull it. You just quietly unloaded the heavy weapon. You took the ammunition of my painful past and you threw it away. You proved that our mature love does not have to be a battlefield. I want you to think about the incredible power you silently, effortlessly possess. You walked into a dark room where every other woman had completely failed. You did not bring a sword to fight the massive demons in my shadows. You just brought a mirror and gently forced me to look at myself. You showed me that the monster I was fiercely protecting was just me. And you loved that hidden, broken version of me without any hesitation whatsoever. That is exactly why no one else will ever take your sacred place. You are not competing with any ghosts from my distant, faded, lonely past. You completely erased the board and wrote your permanent name across my mind. I spent 60 years preparing for a brutal war that was never coming. I built a fortress to protect myself from a completely imaginary, fabricated enemy. And, in the end, the only thing I needed true protection from was myself. You saved me from the suffocating prison of my own brilliant, paranoid design. You stepped over the rubble of my walls with total, absolute, unshakable grace. And you made the terrifying ruins feel like a beautiful, warm, inviting sanctuary. I will never rebuild the walls that you so carefully and lovingly took apart. I will leave the heavy stones exactly where they fell on the ground. They will permanently serve as a massive monument to the day I woke up. I know you have your own deep scars from trusting the completely wrong people. I know you spent countless years wondering if you were just too incredibly difficult. You wondered if your complex nature was a dark curse that guaranteed your loneliness. I am telling you right now that your mental complexity is a rare gift. It is the exact reason I finally stopped running from my own empty life. Only a woman with your profound depths could anchor a difficult man like me. A simple woman would have been completely crushed by my heavy, suffocating silence. She would have taken my avoidant distance as a cruel, highly personal insult. But you possessed the mature wisdom to look underneath the freezing cold surface. You intimately knew that a deeply guarded man is often a deeply wounded man. You did not try to forcefully heal the wound with cheap, empty, meaningless words. You just sat beside the open wound until it felt safe enough to close. That is the absolute miracle of finding true love in our later, quieter years. We do not have the energy for foolish games and desperate, dramatic, exhausting chases. We just want someone who recognizes the exact shape of our deeply hidden pain. You recognized my pain because it mirrored the hidden sorrow inside of your own. We were two guarded souls who accidentally bumped into each other in the dark. And, instead of running away, we decided to sit down and light a fire. Do not ever let anyone tell you that you are too emotionally intense. Your intensity is the exact medicine that cured my chronic, lifelong emotional numbness. Without your unwavering gaze, I would have happily frozen to death inside my fortress. You taught me that true intimacy is a completely terrifying, absolutely beautiful destruction. It destroys the false identities we carefully curated for the unforgiving, harsh public eye. It burns down the pristine, fake house so we can finally see the stars. I never wanted to see the stars because I was terrified of the dark. But you gently held my hand and you pointed up at the massive sky. You showed me that the darkness is exactly where the brightest things finally shine. I am no longer the terrifying, unapproachable man that everyone else cautiously avoids. I am simply a man who is incredibly grateful that you ignored the warnings. You walked right past the danger signs, and you confidently claimed what was yours. I want to sincerely thank you for having the incredible courage to stay seated. I want to thank you for not being intimidated by my defensive, theatrical illusions. You are the absolute best thing that ever breached my carefully guarded, lonely perimeter. I will spend the rest of my days deeply honoring the massive risk you took. I will leave the fortress empty and bravely walk with you in the open field, because the most dangerous place in the entire world is a life lived completely alone. We build our heavy walls to keep the painful, chaotic world safely outside, but the massive walls do not actually stop the inevitable arrival of the pain. They only stop the arrival of the one person who could make it bearable. So, I have to ask you one final, completely honest question today. When you first looked at my heavy walls and my freezing cold, distant stare, did you see a fortress to conquer, or a frightened man begging to be found? Tell me your exact, honest answer in the comments below right now. I will be reading every single word you choose to write to me today. If you understand this quiet confession, subscribe to the channel and stay right here. Disclaimer: this content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The psychological insights presented are not intended to replace professional psychiatric advice.